Good evening and welcome, beautiful viewer. Before we begin this journey, I would love for you to leave a comment below on where in the world you are and what time it may be showing on your clock. You don't need to do this, but the gesture always fills me with joy and gratitude. Step away from the light of your screen. Let the certainties of your modern world dissolve. We are traveling back to a place of profound and unsettling darkness. Not the darkness of a distant medieval past, but one much closer. A darkness that festered in the heart of a society that was educated, devout, and convinced of its own righteousness. We are going to a small, anxious village on the edge of a vast and terrifying wilderness, a place called Salem. The story of the Salem Witch Trials is a story we think we know, a tale of superstitious villagers, hysterical teenage girls, and a tragic, isolated moment of madness. But this comforting, simplistic narrative is a profound illusion. It masks a far deeper and more calculated evil, an evil that was not born of ignorance but was nurtured by faith, codified by law, and driven by the coldest of human desires. To understand what truly happened in that cold winter of 1692, we must first understand the world that made it possible. We must enter the mind of the Puritan, a mind at war with itself and with a world it believed was saturated literally and constantly with the presence of the devil. The evil that erupted in Salem was not a sudden blaze. It was the inevitable fire in a tinderbox that had been carefully filled for generations. To understand the Puritan mind, one must first grapple with its central, terrifying, and all-consuming anxiety, the doctrine of predestination. This was the theological bedrock of their Calvinist faith, a belief that before the creation of the world, before time itself began, God, in his infinite and inscrutable wisdom, had already chosen who would be saved, the elect, and who would be damned for all eternity. There was absolutely nothing a person could do in their lifetime to change this divine verdict. No amount of good works, no piousness, no charity could earn you a place in heaven if your name was not already written in the book of life. Your eternal fate was sealed before you were even born. This belief created a society consumed by a profound and constant spiritual dread. Every Puritan lived with the gnawing, secret question: am I one of the elect? They searched for clues, for any sign of assurance that they were among the saved. They scrutinized their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own successes and failures for any hint of divine favor. A successful harvest, a healthy child, a feeling of religious ecstasy during a sermon, these might be comforting signs. But a failed crop, a sick child, a moment of doubt or depression, these were terrifying portents that one might be among the damned. Life was a constant, nerve-wracking process of self-examination. And crucially, while good works could not earn you salvation, a life of sin and wickedness was seen as clear evidence that you were not one of the elect. This created an intense social pressure to maintain an outward appearance of perfect piety and moral rectitude, not to earn salvation, but to prove to oneself and to one's neighbors that one was already saved. It was a society of constant, fearful performance. Into this world of profound spiritual anxiety walked the devil. To the Puritans of 17th century New England, Satan was not an abstract concept of evil or a metaphor for human weakness. He was a real, physical, and terrifyingly active presence in their daily lives. He was a fallen angel, a prince of immense power, locked in a cosmic battle with God for the souls of mankind. And they believed that New England, their city upon a hill, their holy commonwealth, was the primary battleground for this final, apocalyptic war. They had carved their society out of what they saw as his territory, the wild, untamed American continent, and he was constantly, actively trying to destroy it. This paranoid and spiritually fraught worldview was superimposed onto a physical landscape that seemed to confirm their darkest fears. The world of Salem in 1692 was not the quaint, charming New England town of modern tourism. It was a tiny, precarious settlement clinging to the edge of a vast, dark, and seemingly limitless wilderness. The forest that surrounded them on all sides was not a place of beauty and recreation. It was the devil's territory, a gloomy, foreboding realm of chaos and savagery, the antithesis of the cleared, ordered, and sanctified space of their village. It was from this dark forest that real, tangible threats emerged. The people of Salem Village lived with the recent and ongoing trauma of brutal warfare. King William's War, 1688 to 1697, a conflict between the English colonies and the French and their Native American allies, was raging around them. The frontier settlements to the north and west were being subjected to devastating raids. The people of Salem knew survivors of these attacks, refugees who had streamed into their communities with horrific stories of burned villages, slaughtered families, and captive children. The narrators of these captivity narratives often described their Native American captors in explicitly demonic terms, as servants of Satan who practiced diabolical rites in the dark woods. The fear of attack was a constant low-level hum in the background of their lives. The forest was not just a symbol of the devil's power, it was the literal place from which death and destruction could erupt at any moment. This created a siege mentality, a feeling that they were a tiny, righteous island of godliness surrounded by a sea of savage, satanic darkness. The devil was not just in their hearts, he was just beyond the fence line. Life itself was precarious and harsh. The Puritan work ethic was relentless, but the rewards were meager. The soil was rocky, the winters were brutal, and a single bad harvest could mean a season of hunger. Sickness and death were constant companions. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high by modern standards. A simple infection from a cut, a bout of dysentery, or a difficult childbirth could easily be fatal. Life was a fragile, fleeting thing, and death was an ever-present reality, its causes often mysterious and attributed either to the will of God or the malice of the devil. This daily struggle for survival, this constant proximity to death and hardship, created a community that was physically and emotionally exhausted, a people living on a knife's edge of anxiety. But the most potent and destructive poison in the Salem community was not supernatural, it was entirely, poisonously human. The Salem of 1692 was, in fact, two Salems, and they were locked in a state of bitter, simmering conflict. There was Salem Town, a prosperous, cosmopolitan port on the coast. It was growing wealthy from trade with England, the West Indies, and the wider world. Its merchants were becoming more worldly, more connected to the secular currents of commerce, and their values were beginning to drift away from the rigid piety of the first generation of Puritan settlers. And then there was Salem Village, modern-day Danvers, a small agrarian community a few miles inland. The farmers of Salem Village were economically dependent on the merchants of Salem Town, to whom they sold their produce and from whom they bought their goods. They felt exploited and looked down upon by their wealthier, more sophisticated neighbors. A deep and festering resentment grew between the two communities. The farmers of the village saw the merchants of the town as worldly, greedy, and spiritually lax, men who were losing their Puritan souls in the pursuit of profit. The merchants, in turn, saw the villagers as poor, backward, and parochial. This economic and cultural strife was the backdrop for a long and incredibly bitter internal feud within Salem Village itself. The village had been struggling for decades to gain its own political and religious independence from Salem Town. The central battleground for this struggle was the village meeting house and the hiring of its minister. A minister was not just a spiritual leader, he was the most important and often the highest paid man in the community, and control over his appointment was a sign of a community's autonomy. For years, Salem Village had been torn apart by a series of vicious disputes over its ministers. One minister left after his salary went unpaid. Another, a man named George Burroughs, who would later play a central and tragic role in the trials, departed after bitter fights with a powerful faction in the village. Even being briefly arrested for debts the community claimed he owed them. This long-running factionalism had crystallized around two powerful families, the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnam family, led by the patriarch Thomas Putnam, were among the wealthiest and most influential landowners in Salem Village. They were staunch advocates for the village's independence and represented the more traditional, agrarian, and religiously zealous faction. The Porter family, by contrast, had strong business and social ties to the merchants of Salem Town. They represented a more moderate, commercially minded faction that was resistant to the village's complete separation. Nearly every decision made in the village, from land grants to the choice of a minister, became a proxy battle between the Putnam and Porter factions. The community was a web of interlocking grudges, lawsuits over property lines, and deeply held personal animosities. Into this toxic environment, in 1689, stepped the Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris was a man whose personal history seemed almost tailor-made to ignite the coming crisis. He had not been trained as a minister from a young age. He had started his career as a merchant in Barbados, where he had owned 2 slaves, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. After a series of business failures, he had turned to the ministry, a profession for which he seemed singularly ill-suited. He was a rigid, greedy, and deeply insecure man, obsessed with his own authority and convinced that a faction within the community was conspiring against him, a belief that was, in fact, true. His arrival in Salem Village immediately exacerbated the existing tensions. He negotiated a salary that many in the village felt was exorbitant, demanding not just money, but also the deed to the parsonage and ownership of the village's firewood supply. This led to an immediate and furious conflict with many in the congregation, particularly those aligned with the Porter faction. The village was soon embroiled in a bitter public fight over Reverend Parris's contract. Church attendance dropped as his opponents refused to listen to his sermons. Parris, in turn, began to preach increasingly fiery and paranoid sermons, speaking of a satanic conspiracy within his own church, of wolves in sheep's clothing seeking to undermine his ministry. He saw the devil at work, not just in the dark forest, but in the pews of his own meeting house, in the faces of the very neighbors who challenged his authority. By the winter of 1691 to 1692, Salem Village was a community on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was a society steeped in a theology of fear and anxiety, convinced that it was under constant satanic attack. It was a frontier community traumatized by war and fearful of the wilderness that surrounded it. And it was a village tearing itself apart from the inside, poisoned by decades of factionalism, economic resentment, and personal hatred, all of which now centered on the deeply unpopular figure in the pulpit of the village church. The air was thick with a free-floating paranoia, a potent mixture of spiritual dread and personal animosity. The people of Salem were primed to see the devil's work in any misfortune and to see the devil's agents in the faces of their own neighbors. The tinderbox was full. All that was needed was a single, mysterious spark to set the whole thing ablaze. And that spark was about to be struck in the cold, tense, and unhappy home of the Reverend Samuel Parris himself. The winter of 1691 to 1692 descended upon Salem Village with a particular harshness, blanketing the anxious community in a shroud of snow and ice. The world shrank to the confines of the home, to the flickering light of the hearth, a time of enforced intimacy and quiet, brooding introspection. It was in this cold, compressed atmosphere, within the very heart of the village's bitterest divisions, the parsonage of the Reverend Samuel Parris, that the first strange tremors of the coming earthquake were felt. The house itself was a microcosm of the village's tensions. It was a place of rigid piety and deep-seated anxieties, presided over by a minister who felt himself under constant siege from a faction of his own congregation. It was here, in this unhappy home, that the affliction, a malady of unknown origin, would first manifest, not in the form of a theological dispute, but in the tormented bodies of 2 young girls. The first to fall ill was the minister's own daughter, 9-year-old Elizabeth Betty Parris. Shortly after, she was joined in her strange sickness by her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, an orphan who lived in the parsonage as a ward. The nature of their illness was unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. It was not a simple fever, a cough, or a stomach ailment. It was a violent and terrifying theater of suffering. The girls would be seized by fits so powerful they seemed to contort their bodies into impossible pretzel-like shapes. They would fall to the floor, writhing and thrashing as if in the throes of an invisible wrestling match. They would complain of being pinched, pricked with pins, and bitten by unseen assailants, sometimes displaying red marks on their skin as apparent proof. Their vocalizations were just as disturbing. They would scream out in terror for no apparent reason, their cries piercing the grim quiet of the parsonage. They would lapse into long periods of stony silence, their eyes wide and unseeing, as if in a trance. At other times, they would utter strange guttural sounds and blasphemous phrases that horrified the pious Reverend Parris. During family prayers, a time that was the very bedrock of the Puritan household, the girls would clamp their hands over their ears and shriek as if the holy words were a physical torment. They would crawl under furniture, hide in corners, and sometimes launch themselves into the air in bizarre, uncontrolled leaps. The affliction was a spectacle, a chaotic performance of pain and blasphemy that defied all natural explanation. Reverend Parris, a man already predisposed to seeing satanic plots against his ministry, was thrown into a state of profound alarm. His first recourse was to prayer. He gathered devout members of his congregation, including the elders of his church, to hold days of fasting and intense prayer in the parsonage, beseeching God to lift the strange sickness from the girls. But the prayers had no effect. If anything, the girls' torments seemed to worsen in the presence of these holy men, their fits becoming more violent and their blasphemies more pronounced. The power of God seemed utterly ineffective against this strange spiritual malady. Having exhausted his own spiritual resources, Parris turned to the only other legitimate source of authority, medicine. He summoned the local physician, a man named Dr. William Griggs. Dr. Griggs was a respected member of the community, but his medical knowledge, like that of all his contemporaries, was based entirely on the flawed Galenic system of humours. He would have examined the girls, taken their pulse, perhaps inspected a sample of their urine, but their symptoms, the fits, the screaming, the spectral assaults, did not fit neatly into any known category of natural disease. There was no fever to suggest an excess of blood, no catarrh to suggest an overabundance of phlegm. Their affliction was one of the spirit and the nerves, a realm where humoral theory began to break down. After observing the girls' terrifying performances and finding no natural cause, Dr. Griggs made a fateful and explosive diagnosis. He declared, with the full weight of his medical authority, that the girls were not suffering from any known physical illness. The cause of their affliction, he concluded, was supernatural. They were under an evil hand. This diagnosis was the single most important catalyst in the Salem tragedy. It was the match that was thrown into the tinderbox. The phrase evil hand was a well-understood euphemism. It meant that the girls were bewitched. Their suffering was not the result of a natural imbalance, but was being actively and maliciously inflicted upon them by a witch, an agent of the devil. Dr. Griggs's diagnosis, coming from a man of science and medicine, lent a powerful, quasi-scientific legitimacy to the supernatural explanation. It foreclosed any further search for natural causes, such as epilepsy, mental illness, or even fraud, and immediately framed the crisis as a criminal matter, a case of magical assault. The question was no longer, what is wrong with these girls? It was now, who is doing this to them? The search for a cure had become a hunt for a culprit. News of the doctor's diagnosis spread through the small, gossipy community of Salem Village with the speed of a winter wind. The parsonage became a center of morbid public attention. Neighbors and villagers, including other young women and girls, began to visit, both out of concern and a powerful sense of prurient curiosity. They came to witness the strange afflictions for themselves. Among these visitors was a young woman named Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of the powerful village leader Thomas Putnam. Soon after her visits to the parsonage, Anne herself began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms as Betty and Abigail. She was soon joined by others: Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant in the Putnam household, Elizabeth Hubbard, the 17-year-old grandniece of Dr. Griggs himself, and Mary Walcott, another teenage girl from the village. The circle of the afflicted was expanding, and their collective performances were becoming more dramatic and more synchronized, feeding off the intense public attention they were now receiving. While the men of the village were engaged in prayer and consultation, a desperate and illicit act of folk magic was being orchestrated, an act that would directly lead to the first accusations. A neighbor of the Parris family, a woman named Mary Sibley, was deeply troubled by the girls' suffering and frustrated by the inaction of the men. She decided to take matters into her own hands by resorting to an old piece of English counter-magic, a form of divination designed to identify the witch responsible for an affliction. She approached the Paris's slave, Tituba, and instructed her on how to prepare a witch cake. The recipe was a piece of sympathetic magic, as disturbing as it was simple. Tituba was to take a small amount of rye meal and mix it with the urine of the afflicted girls. This foul dough was then baked into a small cake or biscuit. The final crucial step was to feed this cake to a dog. The logic behind this ritual was that the dog, having consumed the evil that was present in the girl's urine, would be drawn to or somehow identify the witch who had sent the affliction. The witch's own familiar spirit, often believed to be a dog, would be compelled to attack the dog that had eaten the cake, or the dog itself might exhibit strange behaviors that would point to the culprit. It was a desperate attempt to use magic to fight magic, a practice that was strictly forbidden by Puritan theology, but which persisted as a powerful undercurrent of folk belief. When Reverend Paris discovered what had happened, that a pagan ritual had been conducted in his own kitchen, he was enraged. He saw it as a profound provocation, a diabolical act that had invited the devil even further into his home. He publicly and harshly admonished Mary Sibley, who tearfully confessed her error before the congregation, but the real pressure now fell upon the slave, Tituba, and upon the afflicted girls themselves. Paris and other village leaders, now convinced that a witch was among them, began to relentlessly interrogate Betty and Abigail. "Who is it that torments you? Who is it that bewitches you?" they would demand day after day. The girls, caught in the eye of a storm of adult anxiety and expectation, finally buckled under the pressure. On February 29th, 1692, they named their tormentors. They identified 3 women. And these first 3 accused were not chosen at random. They were the 3 most vulnerable, most defenseless, and most socially marginal women in the entire community of Salem Village. They were perfect scapegoats. The first was Tituba herself. As a slave, she was at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. She was not even of African descent, as is often depicted, but was likely a Carib or Arawak Indian from the West Indies, brought by Paris from his time in Barbados. To the ethnocentric Puritans, she was a dark-skinned, non-English-speaking outsider, a woman from a heathen land who likely possessed knowledge of folk magic and voodoo, which they equated with devil worship. Her involvement in the witch cake incident, even at the behest of a white neighbor, had already marked her as a practitioner of strange arts. She was an easy and obvious target, a woman with no social standing, no family to defend her, and no legal rights. The second woman named was Sarah Good. Sarah Good was the very embodiment of the disreputable poor. She was a homeless beggar, a woman in her late 30s who survived by wandering from house to house, pleading for food and shelter. She was known for her unkempt appearance, her foul temper, and her habit of muttering under her breath as she walked away from houses that had turned her away. These muttered words, which were likely just curses born of frustration and hunger, were now reinterpreted by her neighbors as malicious, magical incantations. She was a social irritant, a woman who failed to conform to the Puritan ideal of the industrious, submissive female. She was pregnant at the time of her accusation and had a small daughter, Dorcas, who was just 4 years old. Her poverty and her contentious personality made her deeply unpopular. Accusing Sarah Good was a way for the community to project its anxieties onto a figure it already despised. The third accused, Sarah Osborne, was a different kind of outcast. She was an elderly, bedridden woman who had become embroiled in a series of legal and social disputes that had alienated her from many of her neighbors, particularly the powerful Putnam family. Her primary sin was her violation of inheritance norms. After her first husband died, she had taken control of his estate, attempting to disinherit the sons from his first marriage. She then further scandalized the community by taking a much younger man, an Irish immigrant named Alexander Osborne, as her indentured servant and, it was rumored, her lover, before eventually marrying him. She had not attended church services for over a year, claiming illness, an absence that was seen as a sign of spiritual laxity, if not outright impiety. By challenging the patriarchal norms of property transfer and by living openly with a man of a lower social station, Sarah Osborne had marked herself as a disruptive and non-conforming woman. Her long-standing property disputes with the Putnam family are particularly significant, as Ann Putnam Jr. and her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., would become two of the most virulent and prolific accusers. The accusation against Osborne was, at least in part, a supernatural extension of a very worldly legal battle. These first three accused, the slave, the beggar, and the social deviant, were women without power, without status, and without influential allies. They were the community's usual suspects, figures upon whom the village could safely displace its simmering fears and hatreds. Their selection was not a random act of hysterical fancy, it was a deeply political and social act, a targeting of the weak by the powerful. On March 1, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. They were taken into custody and brought to Ingersoll's Tavern for their preliminary examination before the local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. This was the moment the crisis escalated from a private affliction to a formal, public, and legal proceeding. The tavern was packed with the curious and the fearful, all craning their necks to see the accused witches and the tormented girls. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. The examination of Sarah Good was a brutal exercise in guilt-presuming interrogation. Magistrate Hathorne, whose great-grandson Nathaniel Hawthorne would later add a W to his name in shame over his ancestor's role, immediately put her on the defensive. "What evil spirit have you familiarity with?" he demanded. "Not, are you a witch, but which devil do you serve?" Sarah Good, despite her lowly status, fiercely maintained her innocence. "I am falsely accused," she insisted. At that very moment, the afflicted girls, who were present in the room as the primary witnesses, began to writhe and scream. They claimed that the spectre of Sarah Good was biting them, pinching them, tormenting them right there in the tavern. When Sarah Good would purse her lips or look away, the girls would cry out that she was afflicting them with a glance. Every denial she made, every movement of her body, was instantly reinterpreted by the girls and the magistrates as further proof of her guilt. She was trapped in a whirlwind of performative accusation from which there was no escape. Even her own husband testified against her, saying he feared she was either a witch or would be one very shortly. Sarah Osborne, who was so ill she had to be carried to the tavern, also maintained her innocence, but she was old, weak, and confused, and her denials were dismissed. It was the third examination, that of the slave, Tituba, that would provide the crucial, explosive ingredient that turned the Salem crisis into a full-blown witch hunt. Tituba, a woman with no rights and no hope of a fair hearing, initially denied the charges. But after days of relentless interrogation, and likely after being subjected to physical violence, possibly a beating from her master, Reverend Parris, she made a calculated and life-saving decision. She confessed. And she did not just confess, she gave the magistrates and the assembled villagers exactly what they wanted to hear. She spun a fantastical, terrifying tale, a vivid narrative woven from a mixture of her own indigenous folklore, Puritan demonic imagery, and the leading questions of her interrogators. She confessed that she had been visited by the devil, who appeared to her sometimes as a tall man in a black coat, sometimes as an animal. He had tempted her and forced her to sign his book. She described seeing other creatures with him, a yellow bird, a red rat, a black dog. Most importantly, she confirmed the magistrate's deepest fears. She was not alone. She said she had seen the spectres of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with her, tormenting the children. And then she delivered the most terrifying news of all. There were other witches in Salem Village, a whole coven of them, working together to destroy the Puritan community. She had seen their names in the Devil's Book, though she could not read them. She spoke of riding through the air on a pole to attend witch meetings. Tituba's confession was a bombshell. It was the confirmation that all of their worst fears were true. There was not just one isolated witch. There was an organized, satanic conspiracy at work in their village. Her vivid, detailed, and seemingly sincere confession lent a powerful credence to the entire proceeding. It transformed the spectral evidence of the afflicted girls from a subjective experience into an objective, corroborated fact. If Tituba could see the spectres of Good and Osborne, then the girls must be telling the truth. The floodgates were now open. The magistrates had a confession, they had a conspiracy, and they had a mandate to find the other witches whose names were written in the devil's book. The hunt was on. The spark had been struck, and Tituba's confession was the gust of wind that would turn it into a raging, uncontrollable fire. The affliction had begun, but the true evil, the legal, systemic, and calculated destruction of innocent lives was just getting started. Tituba's confession had changed everything. It had transformed a local curiosity, a strange case of afflicted children and 3 outcast women, into something far more vast and terrifying, a confirmed satanic conspiracy. The authorities of Salem Village now had what they believed to be irrefutable proof that a coven of witches was operating in their midst, actively working to undermine their holy commonwealth. The desperate question, who is doing this, now had a horrifying answer. Many people are. The task was no longer to simply identify a single culprit, but to root out an entire hidden network of diabolical agents. To do this, the magistrates of Salem would employ and perfect a series of legal and social mechanisms so potent, so psychologically cruel, and so impervious to the truth that they created a perfect, self-perpetuating engine of condemnation. This machine, once set in motion, would develop a ravenous hunger of its own, demanding more and more victims to keep it running. At the heart of this machine were 3 critical components: the transformation of the legal examination into a public theatre of horror, the official acceptance of a form of evidence that was impossible to disprove, and the creation of a terrible choice that rewarded lies and punished the truth with death. The first component of this terrible engine was the nature of the pre-trial examinations themselves. These were not quiet, sober, fact-finding missions conducted in a closed courtroom. They were explosive public spectacles held in the largest public building available, first Ingersoll's Tavern, and then, as the crowd swelled, the Salem Village Meeting House itself. The meeting house was the sacred center of Puritan life, the place of worship and civic governance. By moving the examinations there, the magistrates were symbolically merging the authority of the law with the authority of God. The proceedings took on the air of a holy inquest, a dramatic public exorcism of the evil that had invaded their community. The layout of the room was pure theatre. At the front, on a raised platform, sat the examining magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, embodying the stern, patriarchal power of the state. Before them stood the accused, isolated and exposed. But the true stars of the show, the dynamic center of every proceeding, were the afflicted girls. They were not relegated to a witness box, but were given pride of place at the front of the congregation, where their every torment, every shriek, every contortion could be seen and felt by the entire community. They were the chorus, the narrators, and the living evidence, all at once. The rest of the meeting house would be packed to the rafters with the villagers of Salem and people from neighboring towns who had traveled for miles to witness the unfolding drama. It was the most terrifying and compelling show they had ever seen. The examinations began with a presumption of guilt. John Hathorne's opening questions were not designed to determine if a crime had been committed, but to force a confession for a crime he had already decided was real. He would begin, as he did with Rebecca Nurse, with a question like, "What do you say, you being charged with hurting these poor children?" The very framing of the question, not if you hurt them, but why you hurt them, placed the accused in an immediate and impossible defensive position. Every denial was met with skepticism and scorn. But the true horror of the examination lay in the interactive performance between the accused and the afflicted. The girls had discovered, either through conscious collusion, psychological contagion, or a terrifying feedback loop of communal hysteria, that their torments could be synchronized with the actions of the person on the stand. The result was a grotesque, real-time voodoo doll effect. When the accused woman would shift her weight from one foot to another, the girls would cry out that they were being pushed and tormented, their own bodies lurching in unison. If the accused nervously wrung her hands, the girls would scream that their wrists were being twisted, their fingers broken. If the accused bit her lip in concentration or fear, the girls would shriek that they were being bitten, sometimes revealing what appeared to be teeth marks on their arms. The most powerful effect was the evil eye. If the accused so much as glanced in the direction of the afflicted, the girls would fall to the floor in violent, synchronized convulsions, as if struck by an invisible bolt of lightning. The magistrate would then command the accused, "Look upon the afflicted," and as she did, the fits would intensify. The only way to stop these torments was for the accused to physically touch the afflicted girls. The magistrates would order the accused to be brought forward and to lay her hand upon the convulsing teenagers. The moment she did so, the girls' fits would often cease as abruptly as they had begun. To the modern mind, this suggests a clear case of fraud or psychosomatic suggestion. But to the Puritan mind, steeped in the logic of witchcraft, this was irrefutable proof of guilt. The theory was that when the witch made physical contact, the venom or evil fluid that was flowing from her spectre into the bodies of the afflicted would flow back into its source, giving the girls temporary relief. This touch test became one of the most damning pieces of physical evidence used in the trials. Every successful test was another nail in the coffin of the accused. The examination was not a search for truth. It was a public ritual designed to produce and confirm guilt. A spectacle where the accused was forced to play the villain in a drama directed by their own accusers. The second and most critical component of Salem's legal machine was its official acceptance of spectral evidence. This was the very heart of the evil, the intellectual innovation that made the Salem Witch Trials so uniquely terrifying and unstoppable. Spectral evidence was the testimony of the afflicted that they were being tormented, bitten, pinched, choked, tempted to sign the devil's book by the spectre or spirit shape of the accused person. The crucial damning point was that the accused person's physical body could be miles away, at home in bed or locked in a jail cell, while their spectre was off committing these magical assaults. This was not a new idea in the history of witchcraft belief, but in previous cases in both Europe and New England, it had been treated with extreme caution by the courts. Most learned jurists and theologians understood the profound danger of such evidence. They argued that the devil, being a master of lies and illusion, could easily send a spectre in the shape of an innocent person to torment someone, precisely to cause confusion and lead the godly to condemn the guiltless. The devil's goal, after all, was to destroy the community, and what better way to do so than to make it tear itself apart by executing its own innocent members? For this reason, spectral evidence was almost never considered sufficient grounds for a conviction on its own. It required corroboration from other, more tangible forms of evidence, such as a confession, the discovery of witches' teats, unusual marks on the body where a familiar was thought to suckle, or the testimony of at least 2 other credible witnesses to an act of maleficium, magical harm. The fatal error made by the magistrates and judges of Salem, particularly by the grimly determined Chief Justice William Staunton, was their decision to set aside this tradition of caution. They made the radical and catastrophic ruling that the devil could not impersonate an innocent person. They argued that God, in his divine providence, would never allow the devil to afflict someone in the shape of a good, covenanted Christian. Therefore, if the afflicted girls swore that they saw the spectre of, for example, Rebecca Nurse tormenting them, it must be because Rebecca Nurse had given the devil her permission to use her shape. Her spectre was not a demonic illusion, it was her agent, her avatar, acting on her malicious will. This decision transformed the legal landscape into a waking nightmare. It created a crime that was, by its very nature, unfalsifiable. How could an accused person possibly defend themselves against a spectral accusation? You could produce a dozen witnesses to swear that you were at home asleep in your bed at the time of the alleged spectral attack, but this was no defense at all. The court accepted that your physical body was at home. It was your spirit, your malevolent spectre, that was out committing the crime. There is no alibi for the soul. The only people who could see this spectral crime were the afflicted girls themselves. This meant that the accusers became the sole witnesses, the sole evidence, and the sole victims of the crime they were describing. Their subjective, internal experience of torment was accepted by the court as objective, legally binding fact. This created a closed and terrifyingly circular logic. The process went like this. The afflicted girls would cry out and name a new witch. The magistrates would ask, "How do you know this person is a witch?" The girls would respond, because her spectre is tormenting us right now. The magistrate would then turn to the accused and say, "The afflicted claim your spectre is tormenting them. This is proof that you have made a pact with the devil. What say you?" The accused was trapped. To deny the charge was to call the afflicted girls liars, a brave but foolish act in a room full of people who saw them as divinely touched victims. The very existence of the accusation, born of an invisible spectral crime, became the primary proof of the crime itself. The machine was now fully operational, capable of turning any accusation into a proven fact, with no need for external evidence, logic, or reason. This brought every accused person face to face with the third and most diabolically cruel component of the Salem machine, the prisoner's dilemma, a terrible choice between a false confession and certain death. The logic of the court, combined with the dynamics of Puritan theology, created a perfect, soul-crushing catch-22. Let us trace the two paths available to an accused person standing before the magistrates. Path 1 was to maintain one's innocence. This was the path of truth, integrity, and, for a devout Puritan, the path of keeping one's soul pure before God. You would stand before the court and declare, "I am innocent of this crime. I am a good Christian, and I have made no pact with the devil." But in the twisted logic of the Salem court, this was the path to the gallows. Your plea of innocence was seen as hardened arrogance. Your refusal to confess was interpreted as the devil giving you the strength to resist the godly authority of the magistrates. And most damningly, as long as you maintained your innocence, the afflicted girls would continue to have their fits, pointing at your spectre as the cause of their ongoing torment. Their suffering was the living proof of your guilt. So, by telling the truth, you were providing the very evidence needed to convict you. You would be tried by the court of Oyer and Terminer, found guilty based on the spectral evidence of the girls, and sentenced to hang on Gallows Hill. In Salem, in 1692, telling the truth was a capital crime. Path 2 was to confess. This was the path of the lie. You would have to stand before the court and agree to the charges. Yes, you would have to say, "I am a witch. I have signed the devil's book. I have afflicted the children." To the Puritan authorities, a confession was a victory. It was a sign that the accused had broken with the devil and was returning to the fold of the godly community. A confessing witch was a penitent, a soul on the path back to grace. And because the primary goal of the trials was to expose the full extent of the devil's conspiracy, a confessing witch was an invaluable source of intelligence. For this reason, a pragmatic, unwritten rule quickly developed. Confessing witches would not be executed. Their lives would be spared so they could be used as witnesses against others. So the choice was simple and terrible. Lie, and you live. Tell the truth, and you die. But even this choice was not so simple. The confession itself was a brutal ordeal. It was not enough to simply say, "I am a witch." You had to provide a detailed, convincing, and theologically correct confession that satisfied the magistrates. You would be interrogated for hours, perhaps days. The magistrates would lead you with questions, helping you to shape your story. When did the devil first appear to you? In what shape? Did he offer you fine clothes? Did you sign his book? With blood or with ink? You had to provide a rich narrative full of convincing details. And then came the most terrible part of the confession. To prove that your repentance was sincere, to prove that you had truly broken with Satan's conspiracy, you were required to help the court expose it. You had to name names. Who else did you see at the witch meeting? Whose spectres flew with you through the woods? Who else has signed the devil's book? You were forced to become an informer, an agent of the very court that was persecuting you. And the people you were pressured to name were often not random strangers. They were your friends, your family, your neighbors. To save your own life by lying, you had to condemn other innocent people to face the same terrible choice you had just faced. It was a monstrous mechanism for manufacturing new victims, a diabolical pyramid scheme of accusation. A confession from one person would implicate 5 more. Those 5, to save their own lives, would confess and implicate 5 more each. The web of accusation could thus grow exponentially, driven by the rational, self-interested, and utterly coerced choices of people who had been placed in an impossible situation. This explains the strange and tragic pattern of the Salem confessions. The vast majority of those who confessed were women and girls, many of whom quickly recanted their confessions once the immediate threat of execution had passed, stating that they had been terrified into lying. The people who refused to confess, the people who went to the gallows, were often those with the strongest sense of their own integrity and the deepest faith. People like Rebecca Nurse and the minister George Burroughs chose to die with a clear conscience rather than to live with a damned soul and the blood of their neighbors on their hands. This three-part machine, the public theater of the examinations, the acceptance of unfalsifiable spectral evidence, and the terrible dilemma of confess and live, deny and die, was the true engine of the Salem Witch Trials. It was an engine that, once started, required no supernatural intervention to keep it running. It ran on the most basic and powerful of human fuels: fear, pride, certainty, and the desperate instinct for self-preservation. It was a system perfectly designed to produce the very conspiracy it claimed to be uncovering. The magistrates did not need to find witches. Their legal machine was designed to create them. The evil of Salem was not that a pre-modern community believed in witches. The evil was that they constructed a sophisticated, intellectually defended, and legally sanctioned system to manufacture them, a system where the only escape was to become a part of the machine itself. The machine of accusation that descended upon Salem was not a self-operating entity. An engine, no matter how perfectly designed, requires a hand on its levers. It needs operators, men of authority and conviction who believe in its purpose and are willing to feed it fuel. The evil of the Salem Witch Trials was not simply the product of a superstitious populace or the strange fancies of a group of young women. Its true, horrifying power came from the fact that it was deliberately and enthusiastically driven by the most educated, most respected, and most powerful men in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were not ignorant, backwards fanatics. They were Harvard-educated magistrates, wealthy merchants, and the most influential theologians of their generation. They were the architects of the ruin, the men who took the raw material of fear and hysteria and built from it a scaffold and a gallows. Their willful refusal to question the flawed premises of their own legal creation, their intellectual pride, and their grim determination to prosecute a war against Satan transformed a village crisis into a state-sanctioned massacre. To understand the depth of the evil, we must look into the faces of the men who gave it the unassailable authority of law and God. The first architects of the ruin were the local magistrates who presided over the initial examinations, the men who conducted the theatrical inquisitions in the Salem Village Meeting House. These were John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. They were not judges in a formal sense, but wealthy and respected community leaders. Justices of the peace whose role was to conduct a preliminary investigation to determine if there was sufficient evidence to hold the accused for a formal trial. Jonathan Corwin was a prosperous Salem town merchant. But the dominant figure, the man whose personality would so powerfully shape the proceedings, was John Hathorne. He was a successful merchant and landowner known for his stern, commanding presence and his unshakable Puritan piety. He was the very model of the severe, patriarchal authority that governed the colony. And he entered the Salem Village Meeting House not as an impartial investigator, but as a prosecutor and a warrior. Hathorne's method of interrogation, which we can read in the surviving transcripts, is a masterclass in aggressive, guilt-presuming questioning. He did not seek to uncover the truth. He sought to extract a confession that would validate the reality he had already accepted. He saw himself as engaged in a direct confrontation with the devil's agents, and his questions were theological battering rams designed to break down their defenses. His exchanges with the accused were not interviews, they were spiritual wrestling matches. He would badger, he would mock, he would thunder with righteous indignation. He completely accepted the girls' spectral torments as fact, often turning to them in the middle of an interrogation to ask, "Is she hurting you now?" He allowed their shrieks and convulsions to dictate the flow of the proceedings, effectively making a group of teenage girls the co-prosecutors in his courtroom. Consider his infamous examination of the pious, elderly Rebecca Nurse. He began not with a question of fact, but with an accusation embedded in a question. "What do you say to it?" when others claimed her spectre afflicted them. When she professed her innocence, declaring, "I am innocent and clear as the child unborn," Hathorne did not pause to consider her words. He immediately framed her denial as a form of diabolical trickery. He asked her, "Would you have us believe you?" implying that her plea of innocence was so absurd on its face that it bordered on an insult to the court's intelligence. He relentlessly twisted her words. When Nurse, overwhelmed, remarked that the devil may have taken her likeness to afflict the girls, a concept that was theologically sound and had been the basis for caution in previous witch trials, Hathorne dismissed it out of hand. He treated every denial as a lie, every moment of confusion as a sign of guilt, and every profession of faith as a blasphemous hypocrisy. Hathorne's role was absolutely crucial. As the first point of legal contact, he set the tone for everything that followed. He established the precedent that the accused was guilty until proven innocent, that the girls' spectral visions were to be treated as infallible evidence, and that the only acceptable outcome of an examination was a full confession. He was the man who opened the floodgates. His initial examinations sent a steady stream of accused witches to the already overflowing jails in Salem and Boston, creating the backlog of cases that would necessitate the creation of a special court to try them. He was the first and most important operator of the engine of condemnation. If Hathorne was the operator who fed the machine, the man who designed its most lethal component and sat at its highest lever was William Staunton. In May of 1692, as the jails filled with accused witches, the newly appointed Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, created a special court of oyer and terminer to hear and determine, to handle the crisis. To head this court, he appointed his Lieutenant Governor, William Staunton, as the Chief Magistrate. This was the single most disastrous decision of the entire affair. Staunton was not a trained lawyer, few in the colony were, but he was a man of immense political power and intellectual prestige. He was a wealthy landowner, a skilled politician, and, most importantly, a graduate of Harvard College with a background in divinity. He was a man of unbending Puritan orthodoxy, possessed of a towering intellectual arrogance and a grim, zealous conviction that he had been appointed by God to cleanse the land of Satan's influence. Staunton's appointment as Chief Justice was catastrophic because he brought with him a fatal theological certainty. He was the man who made the radical and decisive ruling that spectral evidence was, in fact, admissible as primary proof of guilt. He wholeheartedly endorsed the flawed legal reasoning that the devil could not afflict a person in the shape of an innocent individual without their consent. For Staunton, this was not a matter of legal debate, it was a matter of divine providence. To believe otherwise, to believe that God would allow the devil to impersonate the innocent to trick his own magistrates, was to believe that God himself was complicit in a cosmic deception. This was an idea Staunton's rigid binary worldview could not tolerate. Therefore, the testimony of the afflicted girls was, in his court, the literal, unshakable truth. Armed with this terrible certainty, Staunton presided over the court not as an impartial judge, but as the chief prosecutor in a holy war. He systematically biased the proceedings to ensure convictions. He allowed the dramatic performances of the afflicted girls to continue in his own courtroom, giving their hysterical outbursts the full sanction of the highest court in the colony. He gave instructions to the juries that all but guaranteed guilty verdicts. He treated the denials of the accused with open contempt and viewed their character witnesses with deep suspicion. His goal was not justice in a modern sense, it was extermination. He was there to identify and eliminate the enemy agents in a spiritual war. The most damning evidence of Staunton's willful and malicious pursuit of convictions came during the trial of Rebecca Nurse. Nurse was a 71-year-old woman of impeccable reputation, known throughout the community for her piety and good character. The case against her was based almost entirely on the spectral torments of the afflicted girls. Despite the overwhelming prejudice of the court, Nurse's quiet dignity and the powerful testimony of dozens of her neighbors on her behalf clearly swayed the jury. After deliberating, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered a shocking verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The afflicted girls began to shriek and convulse with a renewed violence, but it was the reaction of the Chief Justice that sealed Rebecca Nurse's fate. Staunton, his face a mask of thunderous rage, stood and openly berated the jury for their verdict. He angrily declared that they had not properly considered a key piece of evidence. During the trial, when another confessed witch had been brought in to testify against her, Nurse had muttered, "What, do you bring her? She is one of us." To Staunton, this was a clear, inadvertent confession, Nurse admitting she was one of the coven of witches. The jury foreman tried to explain that they had interpreted her words differently. They believed that Nurse, a former church member, alongside the confessor, meant only that they were both of the same society of accused prisoners. But Staunton would not be swayed. His fury and his authority were absolute. He effectively ordered the jury to go back and reconsider their verdict, a form of judicial coercion that was utterly improper. Intimidated and browbeaten by the wrath of the Chief Justice, the jury capitulated. They went back, deliberated for a second time, and returned with the verdict he demanded: guilty. Rebecca Nurse, an innocent woman, was condemned to hang, her life sacrificed not to the evidence, but to the unbending, prideful rage of William Staunton. He was not just an architect of the ruin, he was its most ruthless and uncompromising enforcer. While Staunton provided the legal authority for the trials, the man who provided the crucial intellectual and theological justification was the most famous minister in all of New England, the Reverend Cotton Mather. Mather was a towering figure in the Puritan world, a child prodigy who had entered Harvard at the age of 12. He was a brilliant, prolific, but also deeply insecure and vain man, obsessed with his own importance and desperate to prove the reality of the invisible, spiritual world in an age that was slowly beginning to drift towards rationalism. He was a walking embodiment of the anxieties of his era. He had previously published books on witchcraft, including Memorable Providences, Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions, 1689, a detailed account of a witchcraft case in Boston that had helped to lay the intellectual groundwork for the Salem crisis. Mather's role in the Salem trials was complex and has been debated by historians for centuries. He was not a judge, and he was not directly involved in the prosecutions. However, his presence and his influence were felt at every stage, and he consistently acted as a powerful enabler of the proceedings. He corresponded with the judges, offering them his advice. He attended the examinations and the executions, and most importantly, he took to his pulpit and his printing press to defend the court's actions to a public that was beginning to have serious doubts. His most significant contribution was his book Wonders of the Invisible World, published in October 1692, at the height of the hysteria. The book was written at the direct request of the court, specifically of Judge Staunton, to serve as a public justification for the trials and executions. It is a work of breathless, sensationalist prose, a piece of high-minded propaganda. In it, Mather passionately defends the court's proceedings, presenting the spectral evidence as undeniable fact and painting the accused as monstrous agents of Satan. He recounts the trial testimony in vivid, dramatic detail, always siding with the afflicted girls and portraying the condemned as hardened, diabolical criminals. The book was a bestseller, read throughout New England and in London. It lent Mather's immense intellectual and theological prestige to the court's bloody work, reassuring the public that the hangings were not a tragic error, but a necessary and righteous act in the great war against the devil. The most dramatic example of Mather's role as an enabler occurred at the execution of the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, had been accused of being the ringleader of the witches, a sort of dark pope of the devil's conspiracy. On August 19, 1692, he was brought to the gallows on Gallows Hill. Standing on the ladder with the rope around his neck, he delivered a powerful and eloquent speech, proclaiming his innocence with a conviction that deeply moved the assembled crowd. Then, he did something that was believed to be impossible for a witch. He perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish, without a single stumble or error. The crowd gasped. A core tenet of witchcraft belief was that a servant of the devil, having renounced their Christian baptism, could not speak the holy words of the Lord's Prayer correctly. Burroughs's perfect recitation was a powerful sign of his innocence. The crowd began to stir, to mutter amongst themselves. Some began to suggest that the execution should be stopped, that an innocent man was about to be killed. The execution was on the verge of being halted by a popular uprising. At that critical moment, Cotton Mather, who was present at the scene on horseback, spurred his horse forward and addressed the wavering crowd. He forcefully reminded them of the devil's cunning. Satan, he declared, was a master of disguise, an angel of darkness capable of transforming himself into an angel of light. He argued that Burroughs's perfect recitation was not a sign of his innocence, but was, in fact, the devil's ultimate trick, a final, clever deception designed to save his chief agent from his rightful punishment. Mather's authority, his charisma, and his quick thinking successfully quelled the crowd's doubts. The executioner proceeded with his work, and George Burroughs was hanged. Mather had acted as the theological enforcer for the state, ensuring that the engine of death would not be stopped by something as inconvenient as the appearance of innocence. These men, Hathorne, the aggressive inquisitor, Staunton, the unbending and ruthless judge, and Mather, the brilliant intellectual propagandist, were the indispensable architects of the Salem tragedy. They were the men who built the legal and theological framework that allowed the hysteria to flourish. They took the chaotic fears of a small village and gave them the full, terrifying force and legitimacy of the highest institutions in the land. The evil of Salem was not that a few teenage girls had strange fits. The evil was that these powerful, educated, and respected men, driven by pride, zeal, and a profound intellectual arrogance, chose to believe them. They built a world where truth was punished and lies were rewarded, a world where the law became a weapon and the court became a slaughterhouse. They were the true devils of Salem, and their legacy is a chilling testament to the fact that the most terrible injustices in human history are often committed not by monsters, but by good men who are utterly, terribly, and willfully certain that they are right. The machine was now fully operational. Its architects, the magistrates, the judges, the ministers, had designed its functions and supplied its intellectual fuel. Its engine, powered by unfalsifiable spectral evidence and the terrible dilemma of confession, was running at full throttle, consuming every new victim fed into it. But a machine, however abstract its principles, produces a tangible result. The result of Salem's legal engine was not a set of statistics or a theological treatise. It was a line of real, terrified human beings, standing on a rough-hewn ladder on a windswept hill, a coarse rope scratching at their necks. To truly comprehend the evil of the Salem Witch Trials, we must move away from the abstract and look directly into the faces of the condemned. We must tell their stories, for in the diversity of their lives and the specific, calculated nature of their destruction, we see the true, indiscriminate, and yet deeply personal horror of the witch hunt. The gallows on the hill did not just claim the usual suspects. It claimed the outcast, the saint, and the minister alike, proving that once the machine was running, innocence, piety, and social standing were no defense at all. The very first person to be hanged on Gallows Hill on June 10, 1692, was a woman named Bridget Bishop. In many ways, she was the perfect first victim, a person whose life and reputation made her an easy and almost predictable target. Bridget Bishop was not a quiet, submissive Puritan goodwife. She was a flamboyant, assertive, and independent woman who had been a source of gossip and official censure for years. She was the mistress of not one, but two taverns, establishments that were, in the Puritan mind, inherently places of worldly temptation, associated with drinking, gambling, and disorderly conduct. She flouted the drab and sober conventions of Puritan dress, preferring to wear a striking red bodice and other colourful clothes that made her stand out. She had a sharp tongue and was not afraid to quarrel publicly with her neighbours, including the powerful Putnam family. Her history was already shadowed by accusations of witchcraft. She had been formally accused, though acquitted, some 13 years earlier. This prior accusation made her a marked woman. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1692, the old suspicions were easily revived and amplified. When the afflicted girls first cried out on her, the community was ready to believe it. The evidence brought against her during her trial was a chaotic jumble of local gossip, supernatural fantasy, and neighborly grudges, all presented as irrefutable fact. One man testified that Bishop's spectre had appeared in his room at night, sat on his chest, and choked him. Another claimed that she had bewitched his sow. A team of men who were renovating her old house testified that they had found poppets, small dolls used for image magic, hidden in the walls with pins stuck in them. Bishop fiercely denied the charge, explaining that she had no knowledge of the dolls, but her denials were useless. The most damning evidence came, as always, from the afflicted girls, who put on a spectacular performance of torment in the courtroom. They claimed her spectre was torturing them, and when she looked upon them, they fell into writhing fits. One of the most theatrical moments came when she simply looked up at the roof of the meeting house. As she did, a loud noise was heard, and a board fell from the ceiling. To the court, this was not a coincidence caused by a loose board. It was a clear demonstration of her supernatural power, an act of diabolical vandalism performed with a mere glance. Bridget Bishop's defense was spirited but hopeless. She was trapped in the machine's logic. When the magistrates pointed to her spectre tormenting the girls, she famously cried out, "I am innocent to a witch. I know not what a witch is." The magistrate, John Hathorne, shot back with a classic cynical retort. "How do you know, then, that you are not a witch?" The question was a perfect encapsulation of the court's twisted reasoning. Faced with such logic, she could only repeatedly state her innocence. She refused to confess to a lie, and for this act of integrity she was condemned. Her execution was a powerful statement to the rest of the community. It proved that the court was serious, that it would not hesitate to carry out the ultimate penalty, and it showed that a woman who lived outside the strict boundaries of Puritan social norms was dangerously vulnerable. Bridget Bishop was, in essence, hanged for being different. If the execution of Bridget Bishop served to confirm that the outcasts were unsafe, the conviction and execution of Rebecca Nurse sent a far more terrifying shockwave through the community. It proved, with chilling finality, that no one was safe. Rebecca Nurse was the very antithesis of Bridget Bishop. She was a 71-year-old matriarch, a frail and deeply pious woman who was universally respected for her virtue and godliness. She was a member in good standing of the church, and dozens of her neighbors considered her a living saint. When the afflicted girls first named her as one of their tormentors, it was met with widespread disbelief and outrage. People could not fathom that this gentle, devout grandmother could be an agent of the devil. A petition was immediately drawn up and signed by 39 of her most respected neighbors, testifying to her impeccable character and Christian life. This document, a brave act of collective dissent in a time of growing fear, was presented to the court. It should have been powerful evidence in her favor. But in the Salem courtroom, character and reputation were meaningless against the unfalsifiable claims of spectral torment. The afflicted girls, particularly the members of the Putnam family with whom the Nurse family had a long-standing land dispute, were relentless in their accusations. They claimed that Nurse's spectre was constantly pinching them, choking them, and trying to force them to sign the devil's book. During her examination, Rebecca Nurse, who was hard of hearing, behaved with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to the wild performances of the girls. She consistently and calmly denied the charges, stating, "I can say before my eternal Father I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." When she saw the girls go into their fits, she expressed not anger, but a kind of bewildered pity, asking, "Are you afflicted, you poor creatures?" The most dramatic and damning moment of her trial has already been discussed. After the jury, swayed by her character and the lack of any tangible evidence, returned a verdict of not guilty, the furious Chief Justice William Staunton coerced them into reversing their decision. Staunton had found his saint, and he would not be denied his sacrifice. Even after her condemnation, the community fought for her. The governor himself, Sir William Phipps, issued a temporary reprieve, likely influenced by the sheer weight of public opinion in her favor. But the forces arrayed against her were too powerful. The afflicted girls redoubled their public torments at the news of the reprieve, and a delegation of Salem's most powerful men visited the governor to protest his decision. Governor Phipps, a man of weak political will, buckled under the pressure and rescinded his reprieve. In a final act of cruelty, Rebecca Nurse was excommunicated from her church. The minister, Nicholas Noyes, publicly read the sentence of excommunication, formally casting her out from the community of Christ and delivering her soul, as he saw it, into the hands of Satan. A few days later, on July 19th, 1692, she was taken to Gallows Hill. Frail and infirm, she had to be carried to the gallows in a cart. There, alongside 4 other women, she was hanged. Her body was not given a Christian burial, but was thrown into a shallow, unmarked grave on the hill. Her family, in a final act of love and defiance, came back to the hill under the cover of darkness, found her body, and carried it home to be buried secretly in a proper grave on their own farm. The execution of Rebecca Nurse was a turning point. It proved that piety, a lifetime of good works, and the respect of one's community were utterly useless as a defense. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could. The terror was now universal. The machine, now hungry for a leader for its imaginary satanic conspiracy, soon found one in the figure of the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs was a man of impressive physical strength and a Harvard education. He had served as the minister in Salem Village some years before the trials, from 1680 to 1683, but his tenure had been marked by the same bitter factionalism that plagued Reverend Parris. He had left the village after acrimonious disputes over his salary, even being briefly arrested for a debt that the powerful Putnam family claimed he owed. By 1692 he had moved on and was serving as a minister in Wells, Maine, a frontier settlement on the front lines of the war against the French and their Native American allies. He was a man who had literally been fighting the devilish savages in the wilderness. But his history in Salem Village had left him with powerful enemies, most notably the Putnams. In the spring of 1692, the afflicted girls, led by Ann Putnam Jr., began to name him as their chief tormentor. They claimed that his spectre was appearing to them, boasting of his power, and trying to recruit them into his satanic army. They declared that he was not just a witch, but the ringleader, the king of all the witches in New England. He was the Dark Pope who organized their diabolical sacraments and black masses in the fields outside the village. The accusations against him were a mixture of spectral evidence and outright fantasy, designed to paint him as a figure of supernatural power. Ann Putnam Jr. testified that Burroughs's spectre had confessed to her that he had murdered his first 2 wives, and that their ghostly apparitions had appeared to her, shrouded in their winding sheets, to confirm the story. He was accused of impossible feats of physical strength, feats that could only be explained by diabolical assistance. Several men testified that they had seen him lift a heavy musket by inserting a single finger into the barrel and holding it out at arm's length, a feat of leverage that was considered beyond normal human ability. He was accused of being able to be in multiple places at once, his spectre appearing in Salem while his physical body was known to be miles away in Maine. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and he was brought back from the frontier to face his accusers. His trial was a foregone conclusion. The court, led by Staunton, was determined to convict the man they saw as the general of Satan's army. The spectral evidence was overwhelming, and his protestations of innocence were dismissed as the lies of the arch-deceiver. He was condemned to hang. His execution on August 19, 1692, became the most dramatic and potentially explosive moment of the entire witch hunt. Standing on the ladder on Gallows Hill, with the rope around his neck and the crowd before him, George Burroughs did not act like a guilty man. He did not confess. Instead, he delivered a powerful, eloquent, and moving speech, passionately proclaiming his innocence and his unwavering faith in God. Then he did the one thing that was supposed to be impossible for a witch, a servant of the devil who had renounced his Christian baptism. With a clear, unwavering voice, he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. This was a direct, powerful contradiction of one of the core beliefs underpinning the entire trial. A witch could not speak those holy words. The crowd began to murmur, to stir. People started to openly question the verdict. The execution seemed to be on the verge of being halted by the sheer force of public doubt. It was at this critical juncture that the Reverend Cotton Mather, mounted on his horse for a better view, intervened. Spurring his horse forward, he forcefully addressed the wavering crowd. He reminded them of the cunning of the devil, of the Bible's warning that Satan could transform himself into an angel of light to deceive the very elect. Burroughs's perfect recitation, Mather argued with all his intellectual authority, was not a sign of his innocence. It was the devil's final, most audacious trick, a masterpiece of diabolical illusion designed to save his chief agent from his rightful punishment. Mather's powerful and timely intervention worked. He calmed the crowd, reassured their doubts, and reframed the evidence of innocence as the ultimate proof of guilt. The executioner, his mandate restored, proceeded with his grim task. The Reverend George Burroughs, the man who had preached the word of God in their own meeting house, was hanged. Cotton Mather had successfully saved the trials from the truth. The stories of Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, and George Burroughs represent a cross-section of the Salem tragedy. They show how the witch hunt consumed not just the marginalized and the unpopular, but also the most pious, the most respected, and the most powerful figures when it suited the needs of the accusers and the court. They demonstrate a system that was not just flawed, but was actively and willfully perverse. A system where evidence of innocence was twisted into proof of guilt, where a jury's conscience was brutally overruled by a judge's fury, and where the last, desperate words of an innocent man were silenced by the smooth, self-assured sophistry of a Harvard-educated theologian. The bodies that swung from the gallows on that lonely hill were not just the victims of a tragic hysteria. They were the carefully selected, judicially murdered victims of a system that had fallen in love with the idea of its own righteousness, an evil that wore the robes of a judge and spoke with the voice of a minister of God. The gallows on the windswept hill above Salem town stands as the central, iconic monument to the tragedy of 1692. It is the place where the machinery of accusation produced its final, bloody result. But to focus only on the 19 men and women who were hanged is to miss the full spectrum of the evil that was unleashed upon the community. The system of persecution devised by the architects of the trials was inventive in its cruelty, finding multiple ways to destroy lives, crush spirits, and grind human beings into dust. The evil was not confined to the rope. It lived in the stinking, crowded jails, it was codified in the fine print of legal procedure, and it revealed its basest, most worldly face in the sheriff's cynical seizure of property. And its most singularly brutal and unforgettable act of violence did not take place on the gallows at all, but in an open field, under the immense, crushing weight of stones. This story, the story of a man who was pressed to death, belongs to an elderly farmer named Giles Corey. Corey was 80 years old, a stubborn, contentious, and famously hardy man who had lived a long and often quarrelsome life in Salem. He was no stranger to the courts, having been involved in numerous lawsuits over land and property throughout his life, and he had a reputation for being a difficult and sometimes violent character. He and his third wife, Martha, were known for their piety in their later years, having recently been admitted as full members of the church. But in the paranoid landscape of 1692, their history of conflict made them vulnerable. When the accusations began to fly, Giles Corey initially seems to have been caught up in the hysteria like many others. In a moment, he would come to bitterly regret. He himself testified against his own wife. Martha Corey had been one of the first truly respectable, church-going women to be accused, and her arrest had shocked the community. She was an intelligent and outspoken woman who had been openly critical and dismissive of the afflicted girls' claims, mocking their performances as foolishness. This skepticism made her a target. Under pressure from the magistrates, Giles testified that his wife had behaved strangely, that she sometimes kept him from his prayers, a common accusation against witches. He spoke of a time his oxen had become inexplicably stuck in the mire, an event he now, in the fever of the moment, attributed to her malevolent influence. It was the testimony of a confused and frightened old man, manipulated by the court into implicating his own spouse. But soon after Martha was arrested and jailed, the spectral fingers of the accusers pointed toward Giles Corey himself. On April 18th, he too was arrested and brought before the magistrates. The afflicted girls, particularly Mercy Lewis, who had once been a servant in the Corey household, put on a terrifying performance. They accused his spectre of tormenting them, of trying to force them to sign the devil's book. The examination followed the usual nightmarish script. When Corey shifted his stance, the girls writhed. When he looked at them, they fell into fits. Corey, a man of fierce and stubborn pride, fiercely denied the charges. But as he sat in the Salem jail, watching the legal process unfold, seeing his wife condemned, seeing the pious Rebecca Nurse condemned, seeing the utter hopelessness of a trial in the court of Oyer and Terminer, he came to a profound and defiant realization. He understood that the court was not a place of justice, it was a slaughterhouse. He saw that the judges, particularly Staunton, had already decided the outcome, and that any trial would be a mere formality, a piece of theatre leading to his inevitable conviction and execution. To participate in this sham, to enter a plea of not guilty, would be to grant this corrupt court a legitimacy it did not deserve. But more importantly, he understood the grim, worldly consequences of a conviction. Giles Corey was a man of property. He had worked his entire life to build up his farm, and he wanted to pass it on to the two sons-in-law who had remained loyal to him. He knew that under a legal principle known as a attainder, once a person was convicted and executed for a felony, and witchcraft was the highest felony, their property was forfeited to the state. The sheriff would seize their lands, their homes, their livestock, leaving their family utterly destitute. Giles Corey decided he would not allow this to happen. He would not allow the state that was murdering him to also profit from his death and ruin his children. And so he devised a plan of ultimate, passive, and excruciatingly painful resistance. He decided to exploit a strange and ancient loophole in English common law. When he was brought before the court for his formal arraignment, he was asked to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. Giles Corey refused. He stood mute. He would not speak, he would not plead, he would not dignify the corrupt proceedings with his participation. By refusing to enter a plea, Corey had thrown a wrench into the legal machine. Under the law of the time, a man could not be tried for a felony until he had entered a plea. His standing mute was an act of profound legal defiance. But the law had a brutal answer for such defiance. The procedure prescribed for a prisoner who refused to plead was an ancient and horrifying form of judicial torture known as peine forte et dure, strong and harsh punishment. The goal of this torture was not to punish, but to coerce. It was designed to force the prisoner to enter a plea, any plea, so that the trial could proceed. On September 17, 1692, the court, under the grim authority of Chief Justice Staunton, ordered that Giles Corey be subjected to this torture. He was taken from the jail to an open field adjacent to the courthouse. There, he was stripped naked and made to lie on his back on the bare ground. A heavy wooden board, perhaps a door taken from the jail, was placed upon his chest. And then, the sheriff, the brutal and avaricious George Corwin, began to give the orders. One by one, heavy stones collected from the nearby fields were placed upon the board. The initial weight would have been uncomfortable, then painful, a growing pressure on his chest making it difficult to breathe. After each stone was added, the sheriff would demand, "Will you now plead?" And each time, the old man, his breath coming in ragged gasps, would remain silent, or, as legend has it, would croak out a defiant refusal. The weight grew, one stone, then another, then another. The pressure would have been immense, the board pressing down with hundreds of pounds of force. His ribs would have begun to crack, the strain on his lungs and heart becoming unbearable. It was a slow, agonizing public execution, designed to be a spectacle of the state's power to break a man's will. The torture lasted for 2 days. Robert Califf, a Boston merchant and a fierce contemporary critic of the trials, described the scene with chilling detail. He wrote that as the weight crushed Corey, his tongue was forced out of his mouth, and the sheriff would use the end of his cane to cruelly poke it back in. Throughout this unimaginable agony, Giles Corey's will never broke. According to the powerful legend that has endured for centuries, his final, defiant words, gasped out from under the crushing weight of the stones, were not a plea, but a demand: more weight. It was the ultimate act of contempt for the court, a declaration that their physical power was nothing compared to the strength of his will. He was choosing the manner of his own death, a death so horrific that it would stand as a permanent testament to the court's barbarity, and in doing so he was thwarting their ultimate aim. Because he died without ever entering a plea, he was never technically tried or convicted of a felony. His property could not be legally forfeit. He had saved his farm for his sons. Giles Corey was pressed to death on September 19, 1692. He was the only man in American history to suffer this brutal fate. His death was a singular act of horror that stood apart even from the hangings, a stark demonstration of the depths of the court's cruelty when its authority was challenged. It was the evil of the system laid bare, a system that would rather slowly crush a man to death in a field than allow him the victory of his silence. While Giles Corey's death was a unique spectacle, the slow, anonymous death experienced by many others in the prisons was a more insidious, but no less evil, aspect of the Salem system. The jails of 17th century New England were not designed for long-term incarceration. They were small, squalid holding pens, often little more than a single, dark, unheated room in the basement of a tavern or a private home. The conditions were universally horrific. The jails were massively overcrowded, with dozens of accused witches, men, women, and children, crammed together in a small, airless space. There was no sanitation, no bedding, no source of heat against the bitter New England cold. The air was foul with the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Disease, such as typhus or jail fever, was rampant. But the most shocking and evil aspect of the prison system was its financial structure. Imprisonment was not free. In a truly perverse piece of bureaucratic cruelty, the accused were legally required to pay for their own incarceration. They were charged a weekly fee by the jailer for their food and board, a meager portion of bread and water. They were charged for the very shackles that bound them, a fee for the easement of the irons. If they wanted a blanket against the cold, they had to pay for it. If they had no money, they starved unless their families were able to bring them food, a difficult task for those who lived miles away and were now ostracized themselves. This system turned the jail into a death trap for the poor and the friendless. Several people died in prison from the brutal conditions long before they could even be brought to trial. Sarah Osborne, one of the first three accused, was an elderly, sick woman who died in the Boston jail just a few months after her arrest, her body weakened by the cold and neglect. Anne Foster, another elderly woman from Andover, confessed to witchcraft under duress but died in the jail before her case could be resolved. And most heart-wrenchingly, the infant daughter of Sarah Good, born in the squalor of the Ipswich jail, died from the cold and malnutrition. These were deaths caused not by a rope, but by the cold, calculated cruelty of the system, a system that saw the accused not as human beings deserving of basic care, but as a source of income for the jailer. The financial evil did not end there. Even if a prisoner was acquitted, or if the trials were halted and they were granted a pardon, their ordeal was not over. They could not simply walk free. A prisoner could not be released until they had paid their entire accumulated debt to the jailer, for every week of food, for the use of their chains. For those who were poor, this was an impossible sum. This led to the tragic situation where people who had been found innocent or were officially pardoned remained languishing in the same horrific jail for months, even years, after the hysteria had ended, simply because they could not afford to buy their own freedom. They had been declared innocent by the law, but were kept imprisoned by their poverty. Tituba, whose confession had ignited the witch hunt, remained in the Boston jail for over a year after the trials ended, until an unknown person finally paid her fees and bought her from the Paris family, after which she disappeared from the historical record. The most rapacious and shameless profiteer of the entire affair was the High Sheriff of Essex County, George Corwin. The law of attainder, which Giles Corey had so bravely defied, stipulated that the property of a convicted felon was forfeit to the Crown. But Sheriff Corwin did not wait for a conviction. In a blatant and illegal abuse of his power, he would ride to the homes of the accused at the time of their arrest and begin the process of seizing their assets. He would confiscate their livestock, their cows, their pigs, their oxen, and sell them off for his own profit. He would empty their homes of their household goods, their furniture, their pewter, their bedding. He treated the accused as if they were already guilty, using the panic of the witch hunt as a cover for systematic, state-sanctioned looting. The family of John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who was hanged for his outspoken criticism of the trials, was a prime example of Corwin's rapacity. The moment Proctor was arrested, Corwin and his men descended on his farm. They stripped the house bare, taking everything of value. They even emptied the larders, leaving his orphaned children with literally no food to eat. They confiscated his cattle and sold them at a fraction of their value. When the trials were over, Proctor's eldest son, Benjamin, petitioned the authorities for the return of his family's property, but they had to fight for years to get back even a portion of what Corwin had illegally seized. This was not the action of an overzealous official fighting the devil. This was the cold, calculated action of a predator, a man who saw in the suffering of his neighbors a golden opportunity for personal enrichment. It reveals the raw, worldly greed that churned just beneath the surface of the theological justifications. The witch hunt was a holy war, but for men like Corwin, it was also a phenomenally profitable business. The weight of stones that crushed the life from Giles Corey was, in the end, a metaphor for the entire system. The trials were a machine designed to crush people, to crush their will, to crush their spirits, to crush their bodies, and to crush their families financially. The evil of Salem was not just in the hangings, it was in the slow, agonizing death by torture of a defiant old man. It was in the cold, anonymous death of a baby in a filthy jail cell. It was in the bureaucratic nightmare of a system that charged a woman for her own shackles. And it was in the cynical greed of a sheriff who looted the homes of the accused before they were even tried. This was the deep, systemic, and multifaceted cruelty that made Salem so much more evil than a simple story of superstition could ever convey. It was the evil of a society that had turned every single one of its institutions, its laws, its courts, its jails, and its officials into instruments of torture and destruction. For 9 long, terrifying months, the engine of condemnation had run with a brutal and seemingly unstoppable efficiency. From the first examinations in March to the final hangings in September of 1692, the court of Oyer and Terminer had processed, condemned, and executed 19 men and women, pressed 1 man to death, and allowed several more to perish in its squalid jails. The web of accusation had grown from a few outcasts in a small village to encompass over 100 people from dozens of towns, reaching all levels of society. The machine seemed perfect, its logic unassailable, its authority absolute, but no fever, no matter how intense, can burn forever. A system built on such a volatile combination of fear, lies, and extremism carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. In the autumn of 1692, the very success of the witch hunt would become the cause of its downfall. The fever broke not because of a sudden dawn of reason or a crisis of conscience among the judges, but for a much more pragmatic and self-interested reason. The afflicted girls, emboldened by their godlike power over life and death, finally went too far. They made the fatal error of aiming their spectral accusations at the untouchables. Throughout the spring and summer, the primary targets of the accusations, while varied, had largely remained within a certain social stratum. They were outcasts like Sarah Good, contentious figures like Bridget Bishop, or respected but not politically powerful individuals like Rebecca Nurse. The architects of the trials, men like William Staunton and Cotton Mather, could comfortably watch and even encourage the persecution of these people without feeling any personal threat. They were purging the lower and middle ranks of the social body, a process they saw as a necessary, if unpleasant, form of spiritual sanitation. But the afflicted girls, particularly the core group led by Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams, had become intoxicated with their own power. They were no longer just poor, overlooked young women from a backwater village. They were the most important people in the colony, visionaries whose words could send a minister to the gallows. This power was a heady and addictive drug, and it led them to become increasingly reckless and ambitious in their choice of targets. In the autumn months, the accusations began to creep up the social ladder with an alarming speed. They began to name people of significant wealth and political connection, individuals who had powerful friends and family who would not stand idly by. They accused wealthy Boston merchants, prominent landowners, and, most dangerously of all, the relatives of the very ministers and magistrates who had been their greatest champions. They cried out against the mother-in-law of Magistrate Jonathan Corwin, one of the original Salem examiners. They accused several relatives of the Reverend Increase Mather, the powerful president of Harvard College and the most respected elder statesman of the Puritan clergy. They even accused the wife of the Reverend John Hale of Beverly, a minister who had initially been a fervent supporter of the trials, but was now forced into a horrified reassessment when the supernatural evil he had been fighting suddenly appeared in his own bedroom. Each of these accusations against the elite sent a tremor of anxiety through the ruling class of Massachusetts. It was one thing to hang a troublesome tavern keeper or a rival landholder from a neighboring town. It was quite another to see your own wife, your own mother, your own sister-in-law threatened with the same fate. The us versus them mentality that had sustained the trials, the righteous authorities versus the devilish conspirators, was beginning to break down. The them was starting to look disturbingly like us. The men who had so confidently wielded the weapon of spectral evidence now had to face the terrifying possibility of that same weapon being turned against their own families. The single most audacious and politically fatal accusation came when one of the afflicted girls named a figure who was, for all intents and purposes, beyond reproach, Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phipps. While the accusation was quickly dismissed and hushed up, the message was clear and terrifying. The spectral hunt had reached the very top of the colonial government. No one was safe. The monster that the magistrates had unleashed was no longer content to feast on the villagers of Salem and Andover. It was now at the gates of the governor's mansion in Boston. Governor Phipps, a man who had been largely absent from the colony for much of the summer, dealing with the military crisis on the frontier in Maine, now returned to a capital buzzing with fear and elite panic. His own wife had been named. The witch hunt was no longer a provincial problem to be delegated to his Lieutenant Governor Staunton. It had become a direct threat to his own administration and his personal safety. The political calculus had fundamentally changed. As the accusations grew more reckless, a growing chorus of quiet doubt began to find its public voice. From the very beginning, there had been skeptics, men and women who recognized the injustice and irrationality of the proceedings. People like John Proctor, who had mocked the girls' performances as foolishness and had paid for his skepticism with his life, had been brave but isolated voices. Now, however, a more coordinated and intellectually powerful opposition began to form, centered not in Salem, but in the more cosmopolitan and educated circles of Boston. A group of merchants and intellectuals, led by a man named Thomas Brattle, began to circulate a letter that was a scathing, systematic critique of the Salem court's procedures. Brattle's letter, which was passed from hand to hand in manuscript form, was a devastating piece of rational analysis. He pointed out the obvious and fatal flaw in relying on the testimony of the afflicted girls, whom he described as demented persons and vile varlets. He attacked the use of the touch test, arguing that the girls' reactions were easily faked. He condemned the practice of forcing confessions and then using those coerced, lying confessions to condemn others. Most powerfully, he attacked the court's rejection of caution regarding spectral evidence, arguing that it was a delusion of the devil to believe that a spectre could only appear with the person's consent. He argued, in essence, that the court of Oyer and Terminer was not fighting the devil. It was being played for a fool by him and was actively doing his work by shedding innocent blood. Brattle's letter was a declaration of intellectual war against the Salem judges. The most influential voice to finally join this chorus of dissent was that of the Reverend Increase Mather. As the president of Harvard College and the elder statesman of the New England clergy, his opinion carried immense weight. He was the father of Cotton Mather, and throughout the spring and summer, he had maintained a cautious, ambiguous public stance, seemingly reluctant to openly contradict his more zealous son or the powerful judges. But as the autumn progressed and the accusations spiraled out of control, targeting the wives of his own friends and colleagues, Increase Mather finally decided to intervene decisively. In early October, he delivered a powerful sermon and quickly published it as a tract titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits Personating Men. This document would prove to be the intellectual deathblow to the Salem Witch Trials. While Mather did not deny the reality of witchcraft or the existence of a satanic plot against New England, he mounted a full-scale, authoritative assault on the methods being used by the Salem court to find the witches. He argued, with all the weight of his immense theological learning, that spectral evidence was an unreliable and dangerous foundation upon which to base a conviction. He returned to the traditional cautious doctrine, stating unequivocally that the devil, as the master liar, could indeed assume the shape of an innocent person to wreak havoc. He declared, in a phrase that would become famous, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." He systematically dismantled the logic that had sustained the court. He argued that a coerced confession was worthless, that the touch test was a piece of magical superstition, and that the emotional performances of the afflicted were not to be trusted. While he was careful not to directly attack the judges, whom he referred to as wise and just, the implication of his argument was devastating and clear. The court of Oye and Termina had been convicting and executing people based on evidence that was, in his expert theological opinion, inadmissible, unreliable, and likely a tool of the devil himself. Increase Mather's intervention was the turning point. It provided the necessary theological and intellectual cover for the secular authorities to act. Governor Phipps, already alarmed by the accusation against his own wife and under pressure from the growing faction of Boston elites, now had the justification he needed to shut down the proceedings. On October the 29th, 1692, he issued a formal decree. He forbade any further arrests, released many of the accused on bond, and, most critically, he officially dissolved the special court of Oye and Termina. The court that had been constituted in May with such grim purpose, the court that had sent 20 people to their deaths, was now defunct. The engine of condemnation had been switched off. Chief Justice William Stoughton was absolutely livid. He furiously protested the governor's decision, convinced that they were letting the devil win, allowing witches to escape their rightful punishment. But his power was gone. The political will that had supported him had evaporated. The legal framework he had constructed had been delegitimized by the most respected theologian in the land. The crisis was not entirely over. The jails were still filled with over 100 accused individuals awaiting their fate. To clear this backlog, Governor Phipps established a new superior court of judicature to handle the remaining cases in the winter of 1692 to 1693. But this new court would operate under drastically different rules. Phipps, likely guided by the arguments of Increase Mather and Thomas Brattle, instructed the new judges to largely disregard spectral evidence. The standard of proof was raised significantly. Without their primary weapon, the prosecutors found it almost impossible to secure convictions. The new court began its sessions in January 1693. Case after case that was brought before it resulted in an acquittal. Of the 52 people tried by this new, more rigorous court, 49 were found not guilty. The 3 who were condemned had, under the old system's pressure, confessed to being witches. The momentum had completely shifted. The juries were no longer willing to convict on the flimsy spectral testimony of the afflicted girls. The power of the accusers was broken. When they would go into their fits in the new courtroom, the judges and the public now looked on, not with credulous terror, but with weary skepticism and even annoyance. The show was over. William Stoughton, who was, in a final act of incredible folly, appointed to head this new court as well, made one last stand for his bloody-minded vision of justice. Despite the string of acquittals, he signed the death warrants for the 3 who had been condemned, as well as for several others who had been condemned by his old court but had not yet been executed. But Governor Phipps, now fully in control and determined to end the bloodshed, stepped in. He issued a final, definitive reprieve for all the remaining prisoners. Stoughton, upon hearing that the governor had once again thwarted his will, reportedly flew into a rage, storming off the bench and furiously complaining that the land had been cleared of the devil's agents, but now the gates were being opened for them to return. His war was over, and he had lost. By May of 1693, Governor Phipps issued a general pardon, officially freeing all remaining prisoners accused of witchcraft. The fever had finally, definitively broken. The long nightmare was coming to a close. But the end of the trials did not mean the end of the suffering. The community was left shattered, strewn with the wreckage of the machine's 9-month rampage. The living had to now find a way to live with the dead, to live with the ghosts of their neighbors whom they had accused, condemned, and sent to the gallows. The breaking of the fever was not a moment of joyous celebration. It was a slow, grim, and deeply ashamed awakening into a world that had been irrevocably scarred by a madness of its own making, a madness that had been enabled by the powerful and only stopped when that same power felt the first hot breath of the fire on its own neck. The machine had been stopped, its gears choked with the weight of its own audacity. The court was dissolved, the jails were grudgingly opened, and the spectral clamour of the afflicted girls had faded into an embarrassed, sullen silence. The great Salem witch hunt was over, but the end of the legal proceedings was not the end of the story. An earthquake had shaken the foundations of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the aftershocks would continue to be felt for generations. The fever had broken, but the land was left deeply and permanently stained with the memory of innocent blood, with the poison of broken trust, and with the indelible shame of a community that had committed a monstrous evil in the name of God. The final chapter of the Salem tragedy is not one of dramatic trials, but of a slow, grim, and incomplete reckoning. A story of ruined lives, halting apologies, and the lingering ghosts that would forever haunt the New England conscience. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of devastation. 20 innocent people were dead, executed by the state. Several more had perished in the squalid prisons. The lives of the hundreds who had been accused, imprisoned, and impoverished would never be the same. They emerged from the jails not to a welcoming community, but to a world of ruin. Their farms had lain fallow for a year. Their livestock had been sold or had starved. Their homes had been looted by the avaricious Sheriff Corwin. They were physically free, but they were financially destroyed, and they carried a social stigma that would cling to them and their children for years. How could you ever truly be neighbors again with the people who had accused you, the jurors who had condemned you, the friends who had stood silently by and watched you being led away in chains? The community of Salem Village, the epicenter of the madness, was shattered beyond repair. The old factional rivalries between the Putnams and the Porters had been inflamed to a murderous pitch. The congregation of the village church was irrevocably broken. The Reverend Samuel Parris, the insecure and paranoid minister whose household had been the source of the first afflictions, found himself presiding over a congregation filled with the families of the victims he had helped to condemn. He had been a key player in the prosecution of Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and Martha Corey, all respected members of his own flock. The surviving relatives of these victims, and those who had bravely opposed the trials from the start, now waged a relentless campaign to have him removed from the pulpit. For 4 years, a bitter war raged within the church. Parris, with a stunning lack of self-awareness and a stubborn refusal to admit any wrongdoing, clung to his position. He blamed the tragedy on the devil, arguing that he and the judges had been tragically deluded by a satanic plot. He portrayed himself as a victim, not a perpetrator. But the tide of public opinion had turned against him. He could not escape the fact that the fire had started in his own kitchen. Finally, in 1697, broken and defeated, he was forced to leave Salem Village in disgrace. He delivered a farewell sermon filled with bitterness and self-pity, a man still incapable of comprehending the depth of the evil he had helped to unleash. His departure was a necessary first step, but the wounds he had deepened would fester in the village for generations. As the years passed, a slow, painful, and deeply reluctant process of public repentance began to unfold. The raw trauma of the event was so great that for several years, most people simply tried not to speak of it. But the sheer scale of the injustice, the execution of so many respected and clearly innocent people, weighed heavily on the conscience of the colony. The first formal step towards atonement came on January 14, 1697, a day officially declared by the Massachusetts government as a day of public fasting and humiliation. A day to pray for forgiveness for the late tragedy raised among us by Satan and his instruments. On that day, in the Old South Meeting House in Boston, one of the central architects of the ruin performed an extraordinary act of public penance. Judge Samuel Sewell, a wealthy merchant and one of the 9 judges who had sat on the court of Oye and Termina, stood up before the entire congregation. He did not speak. Instead, he handed a written confession to his minister, who read it aloud from the pulpit. In the text, Sewell confessed to his blame and shame in the Salem proceedings, acknowledging that he had been misled by mistaken principles. He asked for the forgiveness of both God and the community for the guilt of innocent blood that was upon the land and upon himself. For the rest of his life, Sewell would reportedly set aside one day each year to fast and pray in private atonement for his role in the trials. He was the only one of the judges to ever publicly admit his error and ask for forgiveness. The chief architect, the unbending William Staunton, went to his grave in 1701, never having expressed a single word of doubt or regret. He remained, to the very end, utterly convinced of the righteousness of his actions. Perhaps the most dramatic and moving apology came from one of the accusers themselves. In 1706, a young woman stood before the congregation of the Salem Village Church and asked to be admitted as a full member. It was Ann Putnam Jr., who, as a 12-year-old girl, had been one of the most prolific and vicious of the afflicted accusers. Her testimony had been instrumental in condemning dozens of people, including Rebecca Nurse and the Reverend George Burroughs. Now, as a young woman of 26, frail and in poor health, she sought to make peace with her past. Her written confession was read aloud by the new minister. In it, she spoke of her role in the great delusion of Satan, acknowledging that she had been responsible for the shedding of innocent blood. She specifically asked for the forgiveness of the families of those she had accused, admitting that she had sinned against them. "I can truly and uprightly say," her confession concluded, "before God and man, I did it not out of any anger, malice, or ill will to any person, for I had no such thing against one of them. But what I did was ignorantly being deluded by Satan." Ann Putnam Jr.'s confession is a fascinating and poignant document. It offers a rare glimpse into the possible psychological state of one of the accusers. Was her claim of satanic delusion a sincere belief, a way for her to process the unbearable guilt of what she had done? Or was it a convenient theological excuse, the only socially acceptable way for her to apologize without admitting to conscious fraud? We can never know for certain, but her public act of contrition, like Judge Sewell's, was a crucial step in the community's long healing process. She would die just a few years later, a lonely figure who never married, forever haunted by the ghosts she had helped to create. The government of Massachusetts also made attempts at official restitution, though they were slow, incomplete, and painfully bureaucratic. In 1711, the colony passed a bill that formally reversed the attainder on the names of many of the convicted witches, restoring their legal rights and clearing their names. The bill also offered a sum of money, £600, to be divided among the survivors and the families of the victims as financial compensation. The process of distributing this money was fraught with difficulty and bitterness. Families had to submit claims detailing their losses. How do you put a price on a hanged mother, a lost childhood, a ruined farm? The sums they eventually received were meager, a pittance that could never truly compensate for the devastation they had endured. And even this act of restitution was incomplete. For political reasons, several of the accused were left off the bill, their names not officially cleared for decades, and in some cases for centuries. The final victim of the Salem Witch Trials was not formally exonerated by the state of Massachusetts until 2001. The human cost of the trials radiated outwards, scarring not just the direct victims, but an entire generation. There were the orphans, children like the 4-year-old Dorcas Good, who had been imprisoned with her mother and was so traumatized by the experience that she was emotionally crippled for the rest of her life. There were the families left destitute by Sheriff Corwin's looting, who never fully recovered their economic standing. And there were the deep, bitter divisions that lingered in the community, fault lines of suspicion and resentment that would take a century to fade. The trials left behind a legacy of trauma so profound that Salem became a byword for injustice, a dark chapter that the leaders of New England would desperately try to live down. So we are left, at the end of this long and harrowing story, with the final terrible question. What was the true nature of the evil at Salem? Where did it come from? Was it, as the Puritans believed, the work of the supernatural devil, a literal assault by the forces of hell on God's chosen people? Was it, as later, more secular interpreters would argue, a simple case of mass hysteria, a psychological contagion that swept through a community of credulous, superstitious peasants? Or was it something more deliberate, more human, and therefore more terrifying? The truth is that the evil of Salem was a composite monster, a perfect storm created by the convergence of multiple forms of human darkness. The supernatural explanation, while central to the worldview of the participants, cannot satisfy us. There was no devil in Salem, at least not a red-skinned, pitchfork-wielding one. But the belief in that devil was a profoundly powerful and destructive force. It was the ideological fuel for the fire. It gave the perpetrators a sense of absolute divine righteousness, a conviction that they were not murdering their neighbors, but were fighting as soldiers in a holy war. This is the first evil, the evil of absolute religious certainty, the arrogance of believing you know God's will so perfectly that you are entitled to kill in His name. The theory of mass hysteria is also part of the story, but it too is incomplete. It helps to explain the initial afflictions of the girls, a phenomenon that modern psychology might diagnose as a form of conversion disorder or psychosomatic illness, a physical manifestation of the immense psychological stress and powerlessness experienced by young women in a rigidly patriarchal and repressive society. Their fits were real, but their cause was likely not witchcraft, but the suffocating pressure of their own world. But hysteria alone cannot account for the systematic, legalistic, and prolonged nature of the persecution. Hysteria was the spark, but it was not the engine. The true, enduring, and most instructive evil of Salem lies in the engine itself. It was the evil of a system, a man-made machine of injustice. It was the intellectual evil of educated men like Stoughton and Mather who willfully chose to accept a form of evidence they knew to be dangerous and unfalsifiable, and who then built a legal framework around it that made conviction all but inevitable. It was the psychological evil of a legal process that presented the accused with an impossible choice: lie and become an accomplice to the system's crimes, or tell the truth and be executed for your integrity. It was the social and economic evil of a community that used the cover of a witch hunt to settle old scores, to eliminate personal rivals, and to seize the property of their neighbors. It was the bureaucratic evil of a system that charged a prisoner for their own chains and left a child to die of neglect in a cold, dark cell. This is what makes the Salem Witch Trials more evil than we could ever imagine. It is not a simple story of a backward people succumbing to a strange delusion. It is the story of how an entire society, from the lowest beggar to the highest judge, can become complicit in a terrible crime. It shows us that the most dangerous devil is not the one who lurks in the forest, but the one that resides in the human heart. The devil of fear, of greed, of pride, and above all, the devil of absolute, unshakable certainty. Salem is a timeless and terrifying warning that the institutions we build to protect us, our courts, our laws, our churches, can, in the right circumstances of fear and division, be turned into the very instruments of our destruction. The stain on that land is not the mark of a supernatural battle. It is the indelible mark of a uniquely human tragedy, a testament to the fact that the most monstrous things in the world are the things we do to one another. The ghosts of Salem do not sleep easily. They are not the spectral tormentors of the accuser's wild fantasies. They are the quiet, persistent ghosts of ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary machine of cruelty. They are the ghosts of Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor who chose truth over life. They are the ghost of Giles Corey, whose defiant spirit could not be crushed, even by the weight of stones. They are the ghosts that live in the court records, in the petitions of the innocent, in the shame-faced apologies of the perpetrators. They are the ghosts that remind us, across the centuries, of the terrifying speed with which a neighbor can become an enemy, a prayer can become a curse, and a court of law can become a gallows. Thank you for listening, and good night.